Laramie, Wyoming Territory, 1872. The wind howled across the plains like a lonesome wolf, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another harsh winter. Delia Wright stood at the edge of town, her delicate fingers clutching the broken silver locket that hung from her neck, the last remnant of a life she could never return to. At 22, she had already weathered more storms than most twice her age, leaving her with the firm conviction that love was a luxury the frontier couldn't afford. The West demanded survival first, and there was little room for matters of the heart when starvation and violence lurked around every corner. Her honey-blonde hair whipped across her face as she gazed at the distant mountains, their jagged peaks rising like sentinels against the vast blue sky. The practical blue calico dress she wore had seen better days, patched in several places but still respectable enough for her position as the town's schoolteacher. Delia had learned early that in this unforgiving territory, independence was not merely desirable but necessary. Trust was a currency too precious to spend on strangers, especially men who inevitably disappeared when winter set in or opportunities arose elsewhere. "A woman alone is a woman alive," she whispered to herself, repeating the mantra that had kept her moving forward since the tragedy 2 years ago. She had built walls higher than the Rocky Mountains around her heart, and she intended to keep them standing no matter what. Delia made her way back to the one-room schoolhouse that doubled as her home, her boots kicking up dust along the rutted road. Children's voices echoed in her memory as she entered the empty building, their lessons finished for the day. The simple quarters behind the classroom offered little comfort, a narrow bed, a small stove, and a trunk containing her few possessions, but it was hers alone. No one to answer to, no one to disappoint, no one to lose. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the wooden floor, Delia's fingers reflexively found the locket again. She never opened it anymore, the pain was too fresh, too raw. Besides, the broken hinge rendered it nearly impossible without forcing it, which she feared would damage it beyond repair. This small piece of silver was all she had left of her family, all that remained of the life she had once known in Pennsylvania before sickness and heartbreak drove her west. The following morning broke clear and crisp, autumn asserting itself across the landscape. Delia was sweeping the schoolhouse steps when she heard the commotion. A small crowd had gathered near the general store, their excited chatter carrying on the morning air. Curiosity getting the better of her, she set aside her broom and made her way toward the gathering. "Cattle drive coming through," old Mr. Harrison informed her as she approached. "Looks like they're stopping to resupply before heading south to Colorado." Indeed, a line of cowboys on horseback appeared on the horizon, dust billowing around them as they guided a substantial herd of cattle toward the town. Leading them was a young man astride a magnificent chestnut stallion. Even from a distance, Delia could see he sat tall in the saddle, his movements fluid and confident as he directed both horse and men with practiced ease. As the riders drew closer, the lead cowboy removed his hat, revealing a head of dark, sun-kissed brown hair. He couldn't have been more than 25 years old, his face youthful but weathered from life outdoors. A light stubble covered his strong jaw, and even from where she stood, Delia could see his eyes were the color of a summer sky. "That's Samuel Xavier," whispered Mrs. Tompkins, the baker's wife. "They say he's taken over his uncle's ranch down near Cheyenne after the old man passed, built it up something fierce in just 2 years." Delia watched as Samuel dismounted with athletic grace, speaking briefly to his men before heading toward the general store. She found herself unable to look away, something in his confident stride and easy smile drawing her attention despite her best intentions. "Miss Wright," called a small voice, breaking her reverie. Young Billy Thompson tugged at her skirts, his face smudged with dirt. "Are we having school today?" "Of course we are," Delia replied, grateful for the distraction. "Run along now and make sure your sister comes too. We're starting with arithmetic this morning." As she turned to head back to the schoolhouse, Delia collided with a solid wall of muscle and leather. Strong hands steadied her by the shoulders, preventing her from falling backward. "Whoa there," came a deep voice, warm with amusement. "I didn't mean to get in your way, ma'am." Delia looked up into the bluest eyes she had ever seen. Samuel Xavier stood before her, his hat held respectfully in one hand while the other still gently gripped her arm. Up close, he was even more handsome than she had first observed, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of a man who found joy despite the hardships of frontier life. It was entirely my fault, Delia said stiffly, stepping back from his touch. I wasn't looking where I was going. Then I'd say we're both to blame, he replied with an easy smile. His gaze dropped momentarily to the locket at her throat before returning to her face. Samuel Xavier, at your service. Delia Wright, she responded, noting with irritation the slight tremor in her voice. I'm the schoolteacher. A noble profession, Samuel said, genuine respect in his tone, especially out here where learning can be the difference between surviving and thriving. Before Delia could respond, Billy Thompson returned, dragging his reluctant sister by the hand. Miss Wright, Lizzie says she doesn't want to do numbers today. Delia seized the opportunity to escape. Duty calls, Mr. Xavier, welcome to Laramie. As she herded the children toward the schoolhouse, Delia could feel Samuel's eyes following her, and she fought the urge to look back. The last thing she needed was the complication of a handsome cowboy, especially one who would undoubtedly be gone within days, continuing south with his cattle and his men. She absently touched the locket, a habit whenever she felt unsettled. Love and attachment were luxuries she could not afford, not after everything she had lost. The frontier had taught her harsh lessons about the fragility of happiness, and she had no intention of setting herself up for more heartbreak. No matter how blue a cowboy's eyes might be. Over the next few days, Delia found herself encountering Samuel Xavier with surprising frequency for such a small town. She spotted him helping the blacksmith shoe one of his horses, sharing coffee with the sheriff on the jailhouse steps, and once, unexpectedly, sitting on a bench outside her schoolhouse, whittling a small wooden horse as he waited for the children to emerge. Mr. Xavier, she acknowledged coolly as she locked the schoolhouse door behind the last departing student. I didn't expect to see you here. Samuel stood, pocketing his knife and the half-finished carving. Miss Wright. I hope I'm not intruding. I thought perhaps I might walk you to the boarding house for supper. I don't take my meals there, Delia replied. I have a small stove in my quarters behind the classroom. You cook for yourself every night? Samuel asked, genuine surprise in his voice. I prefer my own company, she said pointedly. Samuel grinned, seemingly undeterred by her frosty demeanor. I've kept my cattle drive waiting 3 days already. My foreman thinks I've lost my mind. Why would you delay your journey? Delia asked despite herself. I find myself unexpectedly interested in the educational system of Laramie, he replied, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Delia felt heat rise to her cheeks. Mr. Xavier, Samuel, please. Mr. Xavier, she repeated firmly, I think you should know that I have no interest in frontier dalliances. I'm sure there are many young women who would be flattered by your attention, but I am not among them. To her annoyance, Samuel laughed, the sound rich and warm in the cooling afternoon air. Miss Wright, I assure you I'm not looking for a frontier dalliance, as you put it. I simply find you interesting and thought you might enjoy some company for supper. I've survived quite well without company for 2 years, Delia replied, lifting her chin slightly. Surviving isn't the same as living, Samuel said softly, his expression growing serious. But I won't press where I'm not wanted. Good day, Miss Wright. He tipped his hat and turned to leave, his shoulders straight and his stride purposeful. Delia watched him go, an unexpected twist of regret in her stomach. She quickly pushed the feeling aside, reminding herself of all the reasons she was better off alone. That night, as she prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Delia found herself replaying their conversation. There had been something in Samuel's eyes that didn't match her conception of the typical drifting cowboy, a steadiness, a depth that suggested roots rather than wanderlust. A sudden crash outside startled her from her thoughts. Delia grabbed the small revolver she kept loaded on a high shelf and cautiously approached the back door. The sound of shuffling feet and muffled voices filtered through the wooden planks. Check the schoolhouse too, came a rough whisper. Might be something worth taking. Thieves? Delia's heart raced as she realized she was alone with at least 2 men intent on robbery just outside. The sheriff's office was on the other side of town, too far to call for help. She would have to defend herself. Before she could decide on a course of action, the back door shuddered under a heavy impact. They were trying to break in. Delia raised the revolver, aiming at the door with trembling hands. The second impact splintered the simple lock and the door burst open. A burly man with a filthy bandana covering the lower half of his face stumbled in, freezing at the sight of the gun pointed at his chest. "Get out," Delia commanded, fighting to keep her voice steady. The intruder's eyes narrowed, calculating his chances. "Now, little lady, there's no need for—" "She said get out," came a steely voice from behind the man. Samuel Xavier stood in the doorway, his own revolver drawn and pointed squarely at the back of the intruder's head. "This ain't your business, cowboy," the thief growled, though Delia could see uncertainty creeping into his posture. "I'm making it my business," Samuel replied calmly. "Now, you and your friend hiding by the woodpile have about 10 seconds to disappear before I put bullets in both of you." For a tense moment, Delia thought the intruder might risk a fight. Then with a curse he backed away slowly. "This ain't worth dying over," he muttered, edging past Samuel who kept his gun trained on the man's chest. "Smart decision," Samuel said coldly. "Don't come back." They watched as the would-be thieves mounted horses tied to a distant tree and galloped away into the gathering dusk. Only when they were out of sight did Samuel holster his weapon and turn to Delia. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Delia nodded, suddenly aware that she was still pointing her revolver at the empty doorway. She lowered it slowly, her hands shaking with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. "How did you know?" she managed to ask. "I was having supper at the boarding house and saw them skulking around behind the buildings," Samuel explained, stepping inside but keeping a respectful distance. "Something didn't seem right, so I followed." "Good thing I did." "Yes," Delia agreed quietly, "thank you." Samuel surveyed the damaged door. "This won't keep anyone out tonight, let me fix it for you." Before she could protest, he had already stepped outside, returning moments later with tools he'd apparently brought from his saddlebags. As he worked to repair the broken lock and reinforce the doorframe, Delia found herself studying him. His movements were efficient and practiced, his focus absolute on the task at hand. "You don't seem like most cowboys," she observed. Samuel glanced up with a half-smile. "What does a typical cowboy seem like to you, Miss Wright?" "Rootless, restless," she replied honestly. "Here today, gone tomorrow." "Some are," he acknowledged, returning to his work. "I was that way myself for a time, but a man can't drift forever." "What changed for you?" Delia asked, surprising herself with her interest. Samuel was quiet for a moment, his hands stilling on the door. "I realized I was running from ghosts instead of building something that would last. When my uncle left me his ranch, it felt like a sign to stop running." The simple confession resonated with Delia more than she cared to admit. Wasn't she herself running in her own way, not physically perhaps, but emotionally, keeping everyone at a distance, refusing to form attachments that might lead to more pain? "There," Samuel said, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "That should hold. I added a sliding bolt on the inside too. You can secure it after I leave." "I appreciate your help," Delia said, meaning it. Would you like some cornbread?" "It's still warm." The surprise in Samuel's eyes was quickly replaced by pleasure. "I'd like that very much, Miss Wright." That simple meal marked a turning point, though Delia wouldn't recognize it until much later. They talked as they ate, first about practical matters, the school, his cattle drive, the changing weather, but gradually venturing into more personal territory. Samuel spoke of his ranch near Cheyenne, the struggles and satisfactions of building something from nearly nothing. Delia found herself sharing stories of her students, the small triumphs and challenges of frontier education. What she didn't share was anything about her past or the locket that hung at her throat. When Samuel's gaze occasionally drifted to it, she would subtly change the subject or reach up to tuck it beneath her collar. "My men will be wondering where I've gone," Samuel said eventually, rising to leave. "Would it be presumptuous of me to call on you tomorrow evening? Perhaps we could continue our conversation." Delia hesitated, conflicting desires warring within her. Caution urged her to refuse, to rebuild the walls that had begun to crack during their evening together. But another part of her, a part she had believed long silenced, wanted to say yes. "I have papers to grade," she said finally, compromising with herself, "but you could stop by the schoolhouse after classes end." The smile that lit Samuel's face sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "Until tomorrow then," he said, putting on his hat. He paused at the door, his expression turning serious. lock this behind me, and keep that revolver closed tonight just in case. After he left, Delia slid the new bolt into place, testing its sturdiness. She moved around her small quarters, preparing for bed with mechanical efficiency while her mind replayed fragments of their conversation. It had been so long since she'd had a real talk with anyone beyond the superficial exchanges of daily life. So long since she'd allowed herself to enjoy someone's company. As she undressed, her fingers brushed against the locket. The familiar weight of grief settled over her, dampening the unusual lightness she had felt in Samuel's presence. She closed her eyes, remembering the faces of those she had lost, her parents, her younger brother, all taken by the influenza that had swept through their Pennsylvania town. And then Thomas, her fiancé, who had promised to accompany her west for a fresh start, only to abandon her in St. Louis for another woman. A woman alone is a woman alive, she reminded herself, but the words rang hollow in the quiet room. The next day passed in a blur of anticipation and anxiety. Delia found herself checking the clock more often than usual, alternating between looking forward to Samuel's visit and chiding herself for caring. When the last child had finally departed and the schoolroom was tidy, she changed from her teaching dress to her one other decent outfit, a simple green cotton dress that complemented her eyes. Samuel arrived precisely when expected, knocking politely at the front door of the schoolhouse rather than the private entrance to her quarters. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance as well, his clothes clean and his face freshly shaved. In his hands he held a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For you," he said, offering it with an almost boyish nervousness. "A small token of appreciation for sharing your supper last night." Delia unwrapped the package to find a beautifully carved wooden box, its lid decorated with intricate flowers and vines. "It's lovely," she breathed, running her fingers over the polished surface. "I noticed you keep your hairpins in a tin can," Samuel explained, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "I thought you might like something a bit prettier." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Delia deeply. Most men she had known would have brought flowers or candy, temporary pleasures that required little thought. But Samuel had observed a small detail of her daily life and created something useful and beautiful to address it. "You made this yourself?" she asked, already knowing the answer from the calluses she had noticed on his hands. He nodded. "Carving helps pass the long nights on the trail. My father taught me when I was a boy." "Thank you," Delia said simply, unable to express how much the gesture affected her. They spent the evening walking around the small town, Samuel pointing out constellations as they appeared in the darkening sky and Delia sharing stories about her more memorable students. When they reached the edge of town, overlooking the vast expanse of prairie that stretched toward distant mountains, Samuel grew quiet. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said finally. "The drive can't wait any longer if we want to reach the Byers in Colorado before the first snows." Though she had known this moment was coming, Delia felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "Of course. You've already delayed longer than you should have." Samuel turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I'd like to see you again, Delia. When the drive is done, I mean to come back this way." "Why?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Because in all my travels I've never met anyone quite like you," he answered honestly. "Because talking with you makes me feel at home somehow." Delia's hand went instinctively to her locket, seeking the comfort of its familiar presence. "Samuel, I can't." "You don't have to explain," he said gently. "I can see you carry burdens you're not ready to share. I'm just asking for a chance to know you better when I return." "Nothing more." The sincerity in his voice made it impossible to refuse outright. "I'll be here," she said finally, "teaching school." Samuel smiled, relief evident in his features. "Then I'll find you, early December if the weather holds." He hesitated, then reached out slowly to take her hand, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Delia let him take it, surprising herself with the simple trust of the gesture. His palm was warm against hers, rough with the evidence of hard work yet gentle in its touch. "May I write to you?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, the word barely audible even to herself. They walked back to the schoolhouse in companionable silence, their hands still joined. At her door, Samuel lifted her fingers to his lips for the briefest of kisses before releasing her. Until December, Miss Wright, he said, his eyes holding a promise that both thrilled and terrified her. After he left, Delia sat on her bed, staring at the wooden box he had given her. Something was shifting inside her like ice breaking on a river after a long winter freeze. It frightened her, this thawing of defenses so carefully maintained. Yet a part of her welcomed it too, tired of the isolation she had imposed upon herself. The following weeks brought the first letter, carried by the monthly mail coach that connected Laramie to the larger settlements. Samuel wrote of the cattle drive, the challenges of river crossings, the beauty of sunset over the Colorado foothills, the characters among his men. His words painted such vivid pictures that Delia found herself reading the letter multiple times, imagining him under the vast western sky. She wrote back, hesitantly at first, then with growing ease as their correspondence continued. October turned to November, bringing the first significant snowfall and increasing Delia's doubts that Samuel would be able to return as promised. The mountain passes could become impassable quickly this time of year, and many a traveler had been forced to winter wherever they found themselves when the heavy snows came. As November waned, Delia found herself watching the southern road with increasing frequency, looking for any sign of riders approaching. The locket remained her constant companion, but now it shared space with the letters tucked in her dresser drawer and the wooden box prominently displayed on her small table. The first week of December arrived with bitter cold and howling winds that kept most of the town indoors. School attendance dwindled as parents kept children home rather than risk the weather. On Wednesday afternoon, with only 3 students present, Delia dismissed classes early, watching through frosted windows as the children hurried home through swirling snow. She was stoking the fire in her quarters when a pounding came at the schoolhouse door. Heart racing, Delia rushed to answer it, hoping to find Samuel. Instead, the sheriff stood there, his face grim beneath his snow-dusted hat. "Miss Wright, you'd best come with me. There's been an accident." Delia's blood ran cold. What kind of accident? "Stage overturned about 5 miles south," the sheriff explained. "Driver's hurt bad. There's a passenger too, young fella asking for you specifically. Doc's tending to them both at his office." "Samuel," Delia whispered, already reaching for her heaviest coat and scarf. The walk to the doctor's house seemed endless, the wind cutting through her layers despite their thickness. When they finally arrived, the sheriff led her to a back room where Dr. Miller was just finishing bandaging a man's ribs. Samuel lay on the examination table, his face pale and drawn with pain. A nasty gash had been stitched across his forehead, and his right arm was splinted and bound tightly to his chest. Despite his condition, his eyes lit up when he saw her. "Delia," he said, his voice hoarse but strong, "I told them you'd come." She rushed to his side, mindless of propriety or her previous reservations. "What happened?" The sheriff said the stage overturned. "Ice on the road," Samuel explained with a grimace. "Horse slipped and the whole thing went over. Driver got the worst of it. Broken arm, 3 cracked ribs, and 20 stitches in his head," Dr. Miller supplied matter-of-factly. "He's lucky to be alive, both of them are." Delia's hand found Samuel's good one, squeezing gently. "I thought you were coming on horseback with your men." "Change of plans," Samuel said, managing a weak smile. "The drive went faster than expected. I sent the men back to the ranch while I took care of some business in Denver. Was on my way back when," he gestured vaguely at his injuries. "He shouldn't be moved for at least a few days," the doctor advised. "That arm needs to stay still, and I want to watch for signs of fever from that head wound." "He can stay with me," Delia heard herself saying, to the evident surprise of both men. "I have room, and the schoolhouse is closer than the boarding house." The doctor raised an eyebrow but nodded. "If you're certain, Miss Wright, he'll need help with just about everything for a while." "I'm certain," she replied, her decision feeling more right with each passing moment. With the sheriff's assistance, they managed to transport Samuel to the schoolhouse despite the worsening weather. Delia quickly arranged her small quarters to accommodate her unexpected guest, setting up a pallet near the stove where she would sleep while giving Samuel her bed. "This isn't how I imagined seeing you again," Samuel said as she helped him drink a cup of willow bark tea the doctor had prepared for pain. "Nor I you," Delia admitted, adjusting the pillow behind his head. "But I'm glad you made it back safely, relatively speaking. There were times on the trail when all that kept me going was the thought of seeing you again," Samuel confessed, his blue eyes serious despite the hint of fever beginning to flush his cheeks. Your letters, they meant everything to me, Delia. She felt her own face warm at his words. You should rest now, the doctor said sleep is the best medicine. As Samuel drifted into uneasy slumber, Delia settled into a chair beside the bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest. The situation was wildly improper by any social standard, an unmarried woman caring for an unmarried man in her private quarters, yet she found she didn't care what the town might say. Samuel needed her, and that simple fact overrode every other consideration. The next few days fell into a rhythm of care. Delia canceled classes, posting a notice on the schoolhouse door that school would resume the following week. She changed Samuel's bandages, helped him eat and drink, and read to him when fever made him restless. Dr. Miller visited daily, nodding with approval at Samuel's progress under her attentive care. On the fourth day, Samuel's fever broke, and he awoke more lucid than he had been since the accident. Delia was dozing in the chair beside him when his voice, stronger than before, roused her. You've been an angel, he said softly. I don't know how to thank you. Delia straightened, self-consciously smoothing her rumpled dress. Anyone would have done the same. No, Samuel contradicted gently, not anyone. You've hardly left my side for days, from what the doctor tells me. A knock at the door saved her from having to respond. It was Mrs. Tompkins from the bakery, bringing a basket of fresh bread and preserves for the invalid and his nurse, as she put it with a knowing smile that made Delia blush. The whole town is talking, isn't it? Delia asked after the woman left. Probably, Samuel admitted. Does that bother you? Delia considered the question seriously. A week ago, the idea of being the subject of town gossip would have horrified her. Now it seemed a small price to pay for the certainty that Samuel was recovering. No, she answered truthfully, it doesn't. Samuel's smile was worth any amount of gossip. You've changed since I first met you, Delia Wright. Perhaps I have, she acknowledged, a small smile playing at her own lips. Now, are you hungry? Mrs. Tompkins's bread is the best in the territory. As Samuel continued to improve, he began sharing more about his life and the ranch he was building. He spoke of the house he had designed himself, with wide windows to catch the mountain view and a covered porch where one could sit and watch thunderstorms roll across the plains. It's too big for just one person, he said one evening as they sat by the fire. I always imagined a family there someday. Delia felt her heart quicken at the implied question in his words. She had grown to care for Samuel deeply during their correspondence and these days of enforced proximity, but the walls around her heart had not completely fallen. The locket at her throat seemed heavier suddenly, a reminder of all she had lost. Samuel, she began hesitantly, there are things about my past, about me, that you don't know. I know enough, he replied, reaching for her hand with his uninjured one. I know you're strong and kind, I know you face life head-on even when it's difficult. I know your smile makes me forget every hardship I've ever faced. His fingers gently traced the chain around her neck. And I know whatever story that locket holds, it's shaped you into the woman you are today, the woman I've come to love. The word hung in the air between them, both a gift and a challenge. Love. Such a simple word for such a complex emotion. You can't love me, Delia whispered, tears threatening. You don't even know me completely. Then let me know you, Samuel urged, his eyes never leaving hers. Tell me what you're so afraid of sharing. Delia's fingers found the locket, the familiar gesture now loaded with new meaning. Slowly, she lifted the chain over her head, holding the silver oval in her palm where they both could see it. It's broken, she said quietly. The hinge snapped during my journey west. I haven't been able to open it since. Samuel studied it for a moment. May I? With trembling hands, Delia passed him the locket. Samuel examined it carefully, his fingers gentle as they tested the damaged hinge. I think I can. There was a small click, and the locket opened in his palm, revealing its contents for the first time in 2 years. Inside were 2 small, faded photographs, a family of 4 on one side and on the other, a young man in a Union Army uniform. My family, Delia explained, her voice thick with emotion as she pointed to the first image. My parents and my little brother, James, they all died of influenza in 1870. And this, she continued, indicating the soldier, was Thomas, my fiancé. Samuel asked gently. Delia nodded, the painful story spilling out at last. He survived the war only to die of a broken heart, his, not mine. He promised to come west with me after my family died. We were to be married in St. Louis before continuing to California, but her voice faltered. He found someone else, Samuel finished for her, understanding dawning in his eyes. Yes, he told me the night before our wedding was to take place, said he'd fallen in love with a widow he'd met while securing our travel arrangements. The old pain washed through her, but it felt distant now, like a storm viewed from shelter. I had already lost my entire family, losing him too, and in such a way. I decided then that love was too dangerous, too unreliable, that I was better off alone. Samuel closed the locket gently, holding it in his palm like something precious. So you came to Laramie instead of California. The stage stopped here for repairs, Delia explained. While waiting, I saw and noticed that the town needed a teacher. It seemed as good a place as any to disappear. And the locket. Why keep it if it holds such painful memories? Delia considered this, realizing she had never fully examined her reasons. Because it's all I have left of them, because forgetting seemed worse than remembering, even if remembering hurt. Samuel nodded, understanding in his eyes. The past shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us. He held out the locket. This is part of your story, but it's not the whole story, and it's certainly not the end. As Delia reached to take back the locket, Samuel caught her hand, his grip warm and steady. You've been carrying this burden alone for so long, Delia. You don't have to anymore. The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. I'm afraid, she admitted, afraid to trust, afraid to hope. Afraid to love again, only to lose everything. Loss is part of life out here, Samuel said softly. We both know that, but so is finding unexpected joy, building something new from the ashes of what came before. His blue eyes held hers, earnest and unwavering. I can't promise we won't face hardship. No one out here can make that promise, but I can promise you won't face it alone, not if you'll have me by your side. In that moment, looking into Samuel's face, Delia felt the last of her walls crumble. The fear was still there, perhaps it always would be, but it no longer controlled her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future filled with something other than lonely self-preservation. I think, she said slowly, I would like that very much. Samuel's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. When I'm healed enough to travel, will you come see my ranch, see if you might like to make a home there? With me. The invitation was clear in its intention, a beginning, not just a visit. Delia took the locket from his hand and, after a moment's hesitation, placed it on the table instead of around her neck. Yes, she answered, her heart lighter than it had been in years. I would like that too. By mid-January, Samuel had healed enough for travel, though the doctor insisted his arm remain in a sling for at least another month. The school board, understanding Delia's desire to accompany Samuel to his ranch, granted her leave until the spring term, arranging for the minister's wife to take her classes in the interim. Their journey to the Xavier ranch took 3 days by stagecoach, the winter landscape magnificent in its stark beauty. Delia watched Samuel's face grow more animated with each passing mile, his pride in his land evident as he pointed out landmarks and boundaries. When they finally crested the last hill and the ranch house came into view, Delia gasped in appreciation. It was exactly as Samuel had described, a sturdy 2-story structure of logs and stone, with wide windows and a wraparound porch. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney, and several outbuildings stood nearby in good repair. Welcome to the Triple X, Samuel said, using the brand name he'd adopted in honor of his surname. What do you think? It's beautiful, Delia replied honestly. It feels like home, Samuel suggested hopefully. Yes, she agreed, surprising herself with how right it felt. Like home. The ranch foreman, a grizzled older man named Jenkins, greeted them warmly at the door. Good to have you back, boss, ma'am, he added with a respectful nod to Delia. Jenkins, this is Miss Wright, Samuel introduced. She'll be staying with us for a while. If the foreman had any thoughts about the propriety of the arrangement, he kept them to himself. The guest room's all ready, Mrs. Peterson, she does for us, put fresh linens on yesterday. The next 2 weeks were a revelation for Delia. She watched Samuel in his element, directing ranch operations even with his injury, respected by his men and confident in his decisions. She explored the house, admiring the craftsmanship and personal touches that revealed Samuel's character, bookshelves filled with volumes ranging from practical agriculture to poetry, furniture he had built himself, even a small piano in the parlor. "My mother taught piano," Samuel explained when he caught her running her fingers over the keys one evening. "Do you play?" "A little," Delia admitted, "though it's been years." "Play for me?" he asked, settling into a nearby chair. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, Delia played a simple melody she remembered from childhood. The notes filled the room, creating an intimacy that wrapped around them like a warm blanket on a cold night. When she finished, Samuel was watching her with such tenderness that her breath caught. "I want to hear that every evening," he said quietly. "Samuel." "Marry me, Delia," he said, rising from his chair to kneel beside the piano bench. "Not because you're afraid or alone, but because together we're stronger than either of us is separately. Marry me because when you smile, I feel like I can do anything. Marry me because I love you and I hope, you might love me too." Delia looked into his earnest face, this man who had opened not just her locket but her heart as well. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was still present, but it was overshadowed now by something far more powerful, hope. "Yes," she whispered, her hands finding his. "Yes, I'll marry you, Samuel Xavier. Because I do love you, and because life is too short and too precious to let fear steal joy away." They were married in the parlor of the ranch house on the first day of spring, with Jenkins standing as witness and the minister from the nearest town officiating. Delia wore a simple white dress ordered from Denver, with flowers from the newly awakened meadows woven into her honey-blonde hair. Around her neck she wore the silver locket, now repaired properly by the town jeweler and containing new photographs, Samuel on one side and the two of them together on the other. "Something old made new again," she had explained when Samuel noticed it during the ceremony. "Like my heart." The years that followed brought challenges, as frontier life always did, harsh winters, difficult calving seasons, even a brush with rustlers that left Samuel with a bullet graze along his ribs. But they faced each trial together, their bonds strengthening through shared hardship and triumph. In their second year of marriage, Delia gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth, after Samuel's mother. 2 years later, a son joined the family, James, in honor of Delia's lost brother. The house that had once seemed too large for one person was now filled with laughter, music, and the boundless energy of growing children. On the eve of their 5th wedding anniversary, Samuel found Delia on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Their children were already asleep, the ranch quiet after a busy day. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" he asked, settling beside her on the swing he had built the previous summer. Delia smiled, leaning into his familiar warmth. "About how far I've come. From a woman determined to need no one to this, a family, a home, a heart so full it sometimes feels like it might burst." Samuel's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Any regrets?" "Only that I wasted so much time being afraid," she answered honestly. "I could have missed all of this if you hadn't been so persistent." "I knew a good thing when I saw it," Samuel teased, pressing a kiss to her temple. Delia's hand went to the locket at her throat, the gesture now one of gratitude rather than grief. "Do you know what today is, besides the day before our anniversary?" Samuel thought for a moment. "Tuesday." Delia laughed. "It's exactly 5 years since you opened my locket, 5 years since I started learning that the past doesn't have to determine the future." Understanding dawned in Samuel's eyes. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over the simple gold band he had placed there 5 years ago. "The best decision I ever made was following you into that schoolhouse that night." "And the best decision I ever made was letting you in," Delia replied, her heart full of the love she had once been so determined to avoid. As the last light faded from the sky, they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear above the land they both loved. The broken locket had led them here, to wholeness, to family, to a love strong enough to weather whatever the frontier might bring.